Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, and I'm excited for you to join me on Heroes in the Bible, Jesus. Please follow this podcast on Apple or Spotify to get the latest episodes so you can continue strengthening your relationship with Jesus. Welcome to the greatest story ever told. It is a tale of a shepherd's heart for his sheep, a father's love for his children, and a hero's triumph over death and darkness. This is a story that continues to shape and mold the world around us, bringing the divine heart of God right into the hearts of you and me. In this episode, Jesus' identity is revealed in splendor. Up until now, the true nature of Jesus has been somewhat hidden, as if a thin veil has been hiding parts of his deity. This episode culminates in a grand revelation of Christ's divine nature. Before we get there, though, Jesus wrestles, metaphorically speaking, with the Pharisees and religious leaders. Their hardened hearts and dogmatic beliefs have entrenched them in bitterness. Even as Jesus clearly shows himself to be the Messiah, they do not allow themselves to see it. This episode will offer us some grand revelations about Jesus, but it will also give us some warnings. I will do my best to walk you through these revelations and warnings after the episode. Before the episode, we have a prelude, a story captured from a different time and space. We will meet the great prophet Elijah and his battle with the prophets of Baal. The name of Elijah will be mentioned quite a bit in this episode, so pay close attention and listen carefully for the connections between him and Jesus. One of the reasons for the preludes is to remind us that Scripture is a grand tapestry with small threads interwoven uniquely to show us a grand picture. Each moment in Scripture points forward or backward to another moment, making it the greatest story ever told. I pray this episode blesses you. Here is episode 11, Beware and Behold.
Prelude to chapter 11.
We shall see which God is worthy of our worship,
Elijah said, staring out at the people of Israel. He stood before a throng of people, hovering over a bull placed on an altar of wood. He found himself in a clash of gods. He had watched the 450 prophets of Baal cut themselves and dance in front of their sacrifice. Yet their God did not hear them. Their God was distant and worthless. No matter how hard they strived, they could not conjure up the favor of their God. Elijah scanned the crowd. They had turned from their Creator and Protector. They left him and adopted the perverse practices of their crooked King Ahab.
Come closer,
Elijah yelled, beckoning the people to look. Elijah took 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and placed them on the altar. The stones clacked together, echoing over the silent crowd. The people were eagerly awaiting a sign. They had worshipped Baal instead of Yahweh, yet they watched as the prophets of Baal made fools of themselves. For all their numbers, they had no substance. They were like whitewashed tombs. They wore robes of decadence and self-importance, yet they were empty inside. They lacked power. Elijah took a pickaxe and began to dig a trench around his altar. He gestured to the prophets and asked them to pour water over his sacrifice. They did it.
Again,
Elijah said. So they poured more water onto the wood and bull.
More,
Elijah snapped. So they poured more water. The entire trench around the altar was filled with water, and the sacrifice of wood and flesh was completely drenched. Elijah stood near his altar and looked to the heavens.
God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let it be known this day that you alone are the God of Israel.
Elijah lifted his hands in surrender.
I am your servant. I have done everything according to your word. Answer me so the people may know that you are God. Your people must return to you. So show yourself mighty.
As Elijah said these things, a great flash of lightning burst forth from heaven. Its bolt was radiant, and its course was direct. The altar erupted into flames, sending sparks flying in the air. Ash and debris flew into the faces of the prophets nearby. The bull, the wood, and the stones were reduced to a powder under the intense heat. The water was evaporated into a hot steam, burning the skin of people too close. The flames raged, and the people praised. The might of God had descended upon the altar. The people of Israel fell onto their faces. "The Lord is God!" they chanted. They desired a sign from heaven. They desired proof of God's power. They received it. However, people that needed a sign once would need it again. God knew that the people would forget him again. They would turn from him and cling to false idols. They strayed so often because their hearts were far from his. God knew that unless the people had a transformed heart, they would continue to stray from him. One day, God would send another light from heaven. This time, it would consume more than just an altar. It would consume the very heart of mankind. Chapter 11. Beware and behold. Jesus rested in a home in the region of Tyre and Sidon, enjoying a brief moment of anonymity. It was the land of the Gentiles, a place where a Jewish rabbi would never be found. However, Jesus did not follow such prejudiced traditions. He knew that the love of God would eventually reach the nations of Gentiles. However, for now, his mission was focused on the Hebrews. He had entered the house of a faithful follower, but did not want anyone to know he was staying there. He was content to be alone with his disciples and pour into them the wisdom of God. He needed them ready and prepared for the coming days. However, Jesus' fame had stretched beyond the borders of Judea. Before Jesus could even raise his feet to rest, the door knocked relentlessly. Jesus walked to the door and opened it softly. A Gentile woman stood at the entrance, holding her daughter in her arms. The little girl was stirring and grunting. Her eyes were rolled back, and she screamed at the sight of Jesus. It was clear she was possessed by a demon. The woman fell to her knees, holding her daughter up to Jesus. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded,
"Please, cast this demon out of my child. I do not want her to suffer any longer."
Jesus remained standing at the door, looking down at the woman.
Do you not know that I need to feed the children before allowing the puppies a chance to eat? Why would I give the children's food to them?
Jesus asked. He said this regarding his mission towards the Jews before the Gentiles. The woman winced at Jesus' reply. She knew that she was a Gentile. There was no escaping her birth. However, she knew deep down her birth did not disqualify her from the grace Jesus offered. She looked up at him and said,
"That may be so, my lord, but even the pups are allowed under the table to eat of the crumbs that fall."
Jesus nodded, amazed at the woman's persistence and tact. He knelt down and laid his hand on the girl's head. Her gaze would not meet his. She thrashed her head and grunted in her mother's arms. Of course, Jesus would not allow this woman to leave without healing her daughter. He looked at the woman, then back at the girl.
For your statement, you may leave in peace. The demon has left your daughter.
After these things, Jesus returned from Tyre and Sidon to Decapolis, near the Sea of Galilee.
"I have to try,"
the man said incessantly.
"Perhaps the teacher might have more important matters."
The woman replied.
"He's my brother,"
He shouted.
"I would do anything for him, even risk looking like a fool."
The man and his wife debated on whether to approach Jesus or not. They had spotted him in the marketplace near the fisherman's quarter. They were looking and pointing at him, debating on whether to reveal themselves. However, it wasn't long until Jesus spotted them on the corner.
"Now is our chance,"
the man said. His wife nodded, and together they brought forth the man's brother. He was deaf and could barely speak due to an impediment. The lack of language had caused him a great deal of pain. He could not truly connect or share his deepest feelings. They brought him to Jesus.
Please, Lord, please heal my brother.
The man wept. Jesus looked at the deaf man. He tried his best to mumble a greeting, but could not. His tongue had been unable to utter one coherent syllable.
Come with me,
Jesus said, leading them to an alley away from the busy marketplace. Jesus looked at the family with compassion. He held the man's head firmly. He placed his fingers in his ears and then spat into his hands and touched the man's tongue. Jesus gazed up to heaven, speaking with great authority and power. With a loud voice, Jesus yelled,
"Father,
which means,
be opened!"
The man staggered back and fell onto his side. All of a sudden, he could hear the bustling marketplace and the chirping of birds. The sound was overwhelming. However, as he calmed down, he was able to hear the gentle and steady voice of Jesus.
You are well,
he said with a grin. Jesus extended a hand and led him to his feet. The man touched his tongue and held his ears. He looked to his brother and sister.
I am healed,
he said. They were the first words he had uttered clearly his whole life. Tears of joy streamed down their cheeks as they embraced. Jesus brought them in close and placed his finger over his lips.
Be sure you don't tell anyone about this. Instead, worship God and give him thanks,
he said. However, they did not listen. With his new voice, the man proclaimed the name of Jesus to every person he met. Their praise knew no bounds. So Jesus continued to grow in fame. As Jesus' name continued to capture the ears of the people, the Pharisees stirred in anger. Their rage towards him boiled more with each day. Every miracle and every sermon only increased their desire to thwart him. They stirred and plotted against him.
Give us a sign,
the Pharisees shouted to Jesus. They had caught him in the city streets preaching to a group of people. The Pharisees sauntered into view with their chests out and their noses raised high.
You come here wearing the confidence of a man sent from God. Yet each time we ask you to prove yourself, you refuse. Do you not care what we think?
The Pharisees were no longer tactful with their accusations. They had been left to their own bitterness for far too long. At this point, their rage toward Jesus was unquenchable.
Send fire down like Elijah,
they said.
Call for fire to fall down from heaven,
they goaded. Jesus looked at them with intensity. They were whitewashed tombs. Outwardly, they wore decadent robes and carried themselves with piety. Yet there was no life within them. They were dead inside and had cut off their hearts from the work of God. They bore no more fruitfulness than the ancient prophets of Baal. Jesus stretched out his arms.
When you look to the sky and see no clouds, you perceive it will be fair weather. When you look up and see storm clouds, you know how to protect yourselves,
Jesus said.
How is it that you can look to the sky and interpret the weather, but you can't see the signs that are right in front of you?
The crowd around him chuckled. Yet the Pharisees were not amused, and neither was Jesus. He stepped forward and looked at them intently.
I will give you no sign. I will not dance for you when you ask me to. I will not play all these games you desire from me. The only sign that will be given to you is the sign of Jonah, who was in the grave for 3 days and then emerged back into life.
After saying these things, Jesus departed, wanting nothing else to do with them. He and his disciples boarded a boat and left for the other side of Galilee. The boat rocked, and the group gently made their way to the other side of the sea. John was at the front of the boat, looking longingly at the shoreline. He sighed, holding his stomach.
We forgot bread,
he said with a groan.
How could we forget bread? This journey takes a whole day.
Jesus continued to look out at the horizon. He was stirred up by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Their ignorance towards God and their contempt for the kingdom of heaven made him angry.
Beware,
Jesus said, looking out at sea.
Beware the leaven of the Pharisees.
The disciples gave each other looks of confusion.
Is he talking about our lack of bread?
John asked.
I think he is asking us to be careful when we do find bread.
Andrew replied. The disciples could not get their minds off of their lack of bread. Their stomachs rumbled, and they could not perceive what Jesus was trying to tell them. Jesus shook his head.
Do you not understand what I'm saying? We just witnessed a feeding of thousands of people. We gave them bread. So I speak in these terms. Beware. Beware of the leaven that lies within the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They enter in and ruin the good work that we strive for.
He scolded. There was frustration in Jesus' voice. Clearly, the Pharisees caused him to stir. He could not stand the thought of religious leaders causing others to fall away from God. It made his blood boil. After Jesus clarified, they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They reached Bethsaida, and as always, there was a crowd awaiting Jesus. This time, there was a blind man brought to him. The entire crowd begged him to heal him. Jesus took notice that the crowds were beginning to advocate for one another. Now that they understood Jesus had power and compassion, they felt empowered to notice the needs of others. Jesus came close to the man and observed his eyes like a physician. Jesus breathed in deeply. The crowd looked intently, waiting for something majestic to take place. Instead, Jesus spat into the man's eyes. The crowd winced in slight disgust as Jesus took his saliva and rubbed it into the man's eyes. Jesus perceived that the man's eyelids were sealed shut by residue, so he spat on them and began to massage them open.
Do you see anything?
Jesus asked. The man was struggling to understand the shapes he was seeing. He saw blurred images silhouetted in light.
I think I see people, yet they seem to me like trees.
Jesus laid his hands on the man's eyes again and continued to rub. This time, the man could see everything clearly. Jesus sent the man home to worship God and bask in the beauty of his creation. Even the smallest of actions, if they blessed someone, were miracles. Jesus did not need to call down fire from heaven or speak in the language of angels. He simply needed to look, see, and care enough to act. Jesus then departed into the hills with his disciples, where they camped for the night. It was late. The fire crackled under the evening stars. Jesus and the disciples were all quiet. Their usual revelry was replaced with a quiet contemplation that came with exhaustion. The week's events had proven to be taxing. The fire was mesmerizing. The flames flickered to the sound of chirping crickets. John huddled in close to Jesus. He was the youngest of the disciples, no older than 16. He looked out into the darkness beyond the fire, listening to the howling of wolves in the distance. It was a calm moment. It was a precious moment that Jesus cherished. He looked among his disciples, filled with love for who they were and who they would become. He looked to the other side of the fire. They were staring at the fire mindlessly. Jesus decided to break the silence.
Who do people say that I am?
He asked. The disciples shrugged. Andrew looked up.
Some say that you are John the Baptist.
He said while poking the fire.
After he was beheaded, there were rumors Herod thought you were him returned from the dead.
The disciples chuckled, thinking resurrection from the dead was an absurd notion.
Others say you are Elisha, who has returned.
James answered.
He was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Many believe he is bound to return someday.
Jesus looked around the fire at his disciples. He nodded at their answers. John the Baptist was a skilled reformer, and Elijah was an influential prophet. No doubt both of these titles suited Jesus. However, they did not get to the core of who he was. He needed his disciples to truly grasp his identity.
Yes, this is what people say. But who do you say that I am?
Jesus asked. There was silence for a long while as the disciples pondered the question. Simon Peter lifted his gaze to Jesus. He stared through the fire. He was not known as a deep thinker. He was not a profound historian like Matthew, or an intellectual like Thomas. He was not known for his wit. Conversely, he was known for his fast mouth and brash actions. They got him into trouble his whole childhood. Yet this answer came easily, as if it was a voice locked deep within his heart that had been unhinged.
"You are the Christ,"
he said.
"You are the Son of the living God."
The disciples stirred. Many of them had believed that Jesus was the Christ and the promised Messiah. However, they were apprehensive to say it out loud. Yet Simon Peter declared it, making it known for all to proclaim. Jesus sat there, staring at Simon Peter for a moment. He smiled and nodded.
"Yes,"
he said.
"What you have said is true."
The rest of the disciples were in awe. Jesus had affirmed all their perceptions of him. Jesus pointed to Simon Peter and said,
"Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not shown you these things. No man or woman whispered these truths to you. You once stood before me a skeptic, wondering who I was. Yet now my Father has revealed to you who I am."
Simon Peter was moved with humility. He had only said what had been dwelling deep within. He knew from the moment Jesus helped him catch those fish that he was the Messiah. Jesus held up a stone and gestured towards Simon Peter.
"From this day forward, you are Peter, rock,"
Jesus said.
"You are a rock, Peter, an integral brick in the household of God. However, I am the rock, and it is on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it."
Jesus then gestured to the rest of his disciples.
"I will give each of you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever work you do here will have eternal weight."
Jesus picked up a stick from the fire. The end of the stick was bright red and emanating flames. Jesus waved it around methodically.
"I will go to Jerusalem,"
he said.
"There I will suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests."
Jesus continued to wave the stick gently, leaving a trail of light behind.
"They will kill me,"
Jesus said, driving the stick into the dirt. The flame at the end of the stick was extinguished, yet a small spark remained.
"Have no fear, though, for I will be raised on the third day."
He blew gently on the stick, and a small flame returned, growing larger and larger. The stars were shifting in the sky, and the disciples were deep into the night. Many of the men were asleep soundly beside the fire. However, Jesus and Peter were still awake. Peter looked earnestly at Jesus.
"Master,"
he said. Jesus looked up and gave him his attention.
"Yes, Peter?"
Peter shifted in place.
"Far be it from you to be delivered to die. Of course, this will never happen to you,"
he said. Peter's intention was to curry favor with Jesus by reassuring him that nobody would kill him. However, he could not have been more wrong. Jesus rose to his feet and stepped over the flame. He crouched down and looked Peter intensely in the eyes. He pointed behind him toward the flame.
"Get behind me, Satan!"
Jesus said with intensity.
"You are a hindrance to me and quench the work of God. You are concerned with the silly fears of men and not fixed on the mission of the Lord."
With that, Jesus rose up and went to bed. Peter laid awake, quaking in fear over Jesus' rebuke. Only hours prior, Jesus had told him that God's very word dwelled within him. Now he had been rebuked as an enemy of God. Peter knew Jesus would not hold his quick mouth against him. Still slightly anxious, Peter wrestled with his mind until he eventually fell asleep. Dawn approached, and the morning dew laced itself over Peter's beard. He awoke before the sun rose above the horizon. The air was crisp and clean, and a dull light had begun to poke above the distant hills. Jesus crouched next to Peter, smiling and holding his finger up to his lips, signaling for Peter to be quiet. He gestured to the base of the mountain where John and James were waiting. Peter rose from his blankets and followed Jesus. The four of them climbed the mountain briskly, trying to beat the morning light. Peter watched as Jesus marched ahead of them, his legs buried deep into the cracks in the rock, propelling him forward. The mountain became steeper, and the three disciples were climbing the rocks to catch up to Jesus. They saw him make his way to the clearing at the top of the mountain, just in time for sunrise. He was out of their sight now. They looked up as the light was bursting from the top of the mountain. It was the strangest sunrise they'd ever seen. They made their way up, ready to look at the glowing sun over the eastern valley. However, they soon realized that the sun had not yet risen over the hills. The light they had seen was bursting forth from Jesus himself. As they reached the top of the hill, they saw beams of pure brilliance radiating from Christ. His face shone brighter than the rising sun. It was as if his humanity was unzipped, and the essence of his deity shone through the cracks. The sight was amazing and terrifying. The three of them watched in awe as two other bursts of light broke forth from the heavens, descending like falling stars. Beside Jesus descended Moses and Elijah. The three disciples watched as Jesus spoke to them, only he did not speak as an equal. It almost seemed as though he was teaching Moses and Elijah. He had revealed something to them that had been long awaited. The two historic men of faith bowed to Christ as their Lord and spoke to him as God. Peter's heart was racing. He was standing before the three greatest men God had ever sent on earth. James and John watched as Peter ran towards them. Like a little boy, Peter jumped up and down.
Lord,
he shouted,
it is good that all of us are here. We can set up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. It will be...
As Peter was frantically speaking, a bright light fell down from heaven and consumed him like a whirlwind. A cloud of holy radiance whistled around them like a tempest. Peter and the other 2 disciples cowered in fear. This was much more frightening than Jesus' rebuke the night before. It was as if the heavens opened up all around Peter. He covered his eyes from the light, laying in the fetal position on the ground. A voice burst through from the tempest, saying,
"This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him, and only him."
Then, in an instant, the light disappeared. Peter's eyes were clenched shut. He waited for the wind to cease and peeked open one eye. He looked up to see Elijah and Moses gone. Jesus stood there alone in their place. His radiance was gone, but he still carried himself with the same holiness. Jesus extended a hand to Peter and then led the 3 disciples down the hill.
Tell no one of what you saw this morning.
Jesus commanded the 3.
Not until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.
As they were descending down, one of the disciples asked,
"Isn't it said that Elijah will return before the Son of Man?"
Jesus nodded and said,
"It is true, but Elijah has already come back. You did not just recognize him."
The disciples understood who he was referring to. John the Baptist was a voice crying from the wilderness. He was the one who came before Jesus, declaring the way of the Lord. Peter realized he had put Jesus on a similar pedestal as Moses and Elijah. However, he now knew that all the law of Moses and the entirety of the prophets, including Elijah, were all pointing towards their true north, Jesus Christ.
This episode took us to a new level of understanding as Jesus revealed his glory and splendor to Peter, James, and John. Many revelations and warnings were given to us in this episode. We will unpack a few of them together. First, we were given a glimpse into Jesus' mission to the Gentiles. A woman with a demon-possessed daughter found Jesus and begged him to help her. Jesus initially refused and reminded her that his primary call was to the Jews. This woman, perhaps unbeknownst to her, revealed God's ancient plan. Jesus told her plainly, "Do you not know that I need to feed the children before allowing the dogs a chance to eat? Why would I give the children's food to them?" But the woman's reply was brilliant. She said, "That may be so, my Lord, but even the pups are allowed under the table to eat the crumbs that fall." This Gentile woman knew that although she was not a member of God's chosen people, she could still receive God's mercy. A part of Jesus' mission was to bring the Gentiles into the promise of God, and we got a glimpse of that in this episode. In between miracles and moments of tenderness, the Pharisees and religious leaders chimed in. They challenged Jesus and asked him to show them a sign, as if bringing people back from the dead, healing the lame, and giving sight to the blind were not good enough. They wanted a spectacle. "Send fire down like Elijah," they said. "Call for fire to fall down from heaven," they goaded. Here's the thing. People say they want a grand sign in order to believe, but that's not actually how human beings work. The Israelites witnessed God part the Red Sea, send fireballs from heaven, and rain down manna from the sky. Yet they still lost their faith in God multiple times. Peter in our last episode walked on water, yet lost his footing because of his disbelief. The Pharisees ignorantly thought a grand sign would persuade them, but Jesus knew better. Hardened hearts don't automatically become softened because God gives them a sign. Remember Pharaoh in Egypt? The more signs God showed him, the harder his heart became. Once again, Jesus told them the only sign he would give was the sign of Jonah. This was once again a foreshadowing of the 3 days he would spend in the grave before rising on the third day. Later that day, Jesus gave his disciples a warning. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. He spoke in metaphor regarding the corrupting influence of the Pharisees and scribes. Just as a little bit of leaven can affect the entire loaf of bread, just a little influence from the Pharisees can corrupt their hearts. The disciples got a bit tripped up by this metaphor since they had forgotten to pack bread for the trip. They thought Jesus was making a passive-aggressive jab at their forgetfulness. You can sense a bit of Jesus' annoyance several times in this episode, even anger. Jesus was trying to engage with his disciples on a deeper level, and they were getting caught up in shallow nonsense. This episode with the disciples was a challenge and a warning to all of us. Jesus wants to engage you on a deeper level. He wants to touch the deeper parts of your heart and mind. He wants you to think philosophically and spiritually. Be careful to not get too caught up in vapid and shallow arguments. The disciples had moments of stupidity and spirituality just like the rest of us. Sometimes those moments were within the same hour. That was certainly the case for Peter, who had a high moment followed by a low moment with Jesus. When they were all by the fire, Jesus asked the famous question, "Who do people say that I am?" Jesus gave the disciples a second chance at conversation since they failed so miserably earlier. They answered plainly, saying that some said he was John the Baptist and others said Elijah. Those were interesting answers. John the Baptist was a revolutionary and disruptor. It was a compliment and a curse at the same time to compare Jesus to him. Others said he was Elijah, who had returned to make way for the Messiah. This was another fine guess. Elijah was a great prophet. However, both those answers were wrong. It is important for us to note that these are two different ways people describe Jesus today. Many people see Jesus as a revolutionary and great teacher. Some religions reduce Jesus to just a prophet like Elijah. Jesus is much more than a revolutionary or a prophet. Peter, in a moment of complete clarity, describes who Jesus is. "You are the Christ," he says. "You are the Son of the living God." We have walked through this story long enough together to ask this question. Who do you say Jesus is? This is the preeminent question we all must ask ourselves. Seeing what you have seen, hearing what you have heard, who would you say Jesus is? Many people speculated he was Elijah or John the Baptist. The Pharisees and religious leaders came to the conclusion he was a blasphemer or madman. The disciples, however, intimately aware of Jesus' character, came to a different conclusion. He was the Messiah, Christ, the chosen hero of God, the Redeemer of our souls. If you've been listening to this series, and are still unsure about who Jesus is, then I pray you continue to listen. The true identity of Jesus will continue to unfold before us as the series continues. The true identity of Jesus was like this thinly veiled image. The disciples were able to get an idea of him on their own, but only the Spirit of God could have shown Simon Peter the truth. Jesus gave Simon Peter a new name, Rock or Peter. Can I share a very important theological distinction that was made in this episode? Jesus held up a stone and gestured toward Simon Peter. From this day forward, you are Peter, rock, Jesus said. You are a rock, Peter, an integral brick in the household of God. However, I am the rock, and it is on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. The words used in the original Greek matter quite a bit in this portion of Scripture. Simon was given the name Peter, which is Petros in Greek. The word is translated to mean a rock or a stone. This is a stone that is solid but movable, like a brick on a house or a rolling stone on a riverbank. When Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, he uses a different word than Petros. He uses the word Petra, which is translated as the rock. This is a reference to a foundational rock, cliff, or mother rock. It is a word used for something fixed, immovable, and huge. Jesus is calling Peter a rock and himself the rock. Jesus is the foundation on which the church was built, and the gates of hell will not prevail over him. Peter is just a chip off the old rock, so to speak. It was a high moment for Peter, but it quickly turned into a low moment. Out of insecurity and ignorance, Peter rebuked Jesus' claim that he had to die. Jesus, who had just praised Peter hours earlier, looked him in the eye and called him Satan. Quite a step down for Peter, don't you think? Jesus could not have followers getting in the way of what must be done on the cross. This moment serves as a warning to any of us who belittle the necessity of the cross. As believers, our salvation and faith are fixed on what happened on Good Friday, where the sins of humanity were placed on Christ's shoulders in our place. This episode ended with a brilliant scene where the glory of Jesus was completely revealed. Moses and Elijah showed up, and Peter could barely contain himself. Can you blame him? Moses, the representative of the law of God. Elijah, the representative of the prophets of God. Both were there with Jesus in splendor and glory. Naturally, Peter didn't want the moment to end. He wanted to erect tabernacles for them to dwell so people could come worship. In an instant, Peter was caught up in a whirlwind. God rebuked him, and all that was left was Jesus. God spoke clearly, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him and only him." I will leave you with these parting thoughts. What good things have you revered above or equal to Jesus? We often talk about drugs, alcohol, unhealthy relationships as idolatry. But what about the good things in life? What about ministries, marriages, a good job? What good thing have you put above Jesus? Peter learned that it was Jesus and Jesus alone who was worthy of his worship. My prayer for you today is that the glory and goodness of God would be fully revealed to you. I pray that you would be able to take the warnings in this episode seriously, while also feeling empowered by the encouragement as well. I look forward to speaking with you next time as we unpack one of the greatest teachings ever given. Join me for episode 12, The Good Shepherd. Thanks again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Follow the podcast on Apple or Spotify to get the newest episodes right as they come out so you can strengthen your relationship with Jesus. God bless.